the Francis Osoy Professor of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, University of California, San Francisco, Dr. Charles Lim, to deliver his keynote lecture titled Imaging Imagination, Musical Creativity, and the Brain.
Well, thank you very much. This is my first time to the beautiful country of Indonesia. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm extremely happy to hear Dr. Christie's remarks, especially on her birthday. Happy birthday to you. And I want to thank the conference organizers, thank the support of the ministry. I had my first Bobby Gouling today, and it will not be my last. And so I'm somebody, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself before I give you this talk. I'm somebody who thinks about music nonstop, something I love more than just about anything in the world, but something that I had never had the courage to become a musician. And I think those of you that are artists in the room or musicians in the room, you know that there's a conviction, artistic conviction that you have to pursue this calling in your life. For some reason that I still haven't quite figured out, I never had that. I knew I loved music, but I never felt that my purpose in life was to somehow perform in music. Instead, what I've done is tried to understand the human experience of music through the lens of the body. And it is a very biological stance that I take. I'm a surgeon. I spend most of my time in the middle ear. And so what I'm going to do is talk to you about studies that I've done over the past about 25 years or so of thinking about this and research on this to really delve into how it is that we can do this thing called music. Now, everybody thinks about different things when they think of music. This is what I tend to think of when I think of music. And this is the temporal bone. If you've never really considered this structure, and for those of you that are not scientists, let me just take you through this quickly. People that have normal hearing have an external ear structure that interfaces with an eardrum, and then a middle ear structure that transmits vibrations down 3 hearing bones that then go inside the inner ear, which is called the cochlea, to take vibrations, which music is essentially beginning as, and converting them into an electrical representation in your brain so that you hear music. So with that idea in your minds for a moment, let's hear this music together. And so I could probably just stop the talk right there and we'd all be much better for it, having heard a little bit of Stevie Wonder, because I don't know that it gets much better than that. But you can think about this from many different ways. If you're a music producer, you can think about the technology that was used to record that. If you're a composer, you could wonder what Stevie Wonder was thinking when he went through the composition. If you're a scientist, you can wonder how somebody who was blind is able to play the piano and keyboard the way Stevie Wonder does. If you're like me, what you wonder is, how did he do that? And every time I have these musical experiences, these epiphanies that change my world, I think, how? How was that possible? Where did this come from? And so my entire life has been this kind of quest to understand this question of how was it possible that we had this musical experience? And so I became eventually what's called an otolaryngologist. Thank you for trying. And as an otolaryngologist, what I do is I study the ear and hearing. And so I wanted to understand Stevie Wonder, and I wanted to understand music, but instead I heard a lot of this. So this is the nature of the field of otolaryngology when I entered it, and it was very, very far from understanding music. And so I learned very quickly that I was never going to get to the root of music by looking at the eardrum. And so I had to turn my attention towards the brain. And the neuroscientists in the room already know that that's where it's at, but it took me a little while to kind of refocus my attention to the brain. Now, there are many different kinds of creativity. I'm not here to say that the musical creativity is the only one. There's, of course, culinary creativity. We had some of that at lunch today. There's artistic creativity, architectural creativity, athletic, literary, cinematic, scientific, and even surgical creativity. And this is my team doing a cochlear implant surgery. Now, I always do tell people, of course, in surgery, we're not just making it up, okay? We have some general idea of what we're trying to accomplish, and there's a plan that we follow. But just like in life, in surgery, problems come up. Something unexpected happens, and before you know it, you are improvising. And improvisation to me, while it may be the domain of jazz musicians and certain kinds of extraordinary artists, it's also something that we do in regular life. It's a very ordinary behavior that I think is part of what makes us human. And you might even argue that it's how we survived as a species. Now, before we go too further, I'm going to try to give a talk that you don't need to understand anything about music, anything about the brain, or anything about science to get. Okay? And to do that, I want to introduce you to a musician named Hiromi, because if you've never heard somebody like Hiromi play piano, it is somewhat life-changing. And here's Hiromi playing. So if you ever get a chance to hear Hiromi, just go, fly, do whatever you need to do to hear her play. Her piano playing will just blow your mind. You will not understand. And you will hopefully think what I think. How? How is it possible that she could play like that? What happened? Now, before we think that this idea of creativity is a modern idea, let's just reflect back that music is very old. This is a fossilized bone thought to be carved from a bird that is dated approximately 35 to 40,000 years ago, recovered in Germany, perhaps one of the earliest musical wind instruments. Now, the amazing thing about this is to think about what human beings were like 35,000 years ago. I mean, think about what they were like 300 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 35,000 years ago. Why are musicians making instruments? Why are people finding a need to spend the time to make an instrument? You'd think that they're having a hard time surviving. So, and also, what music are they playing? There's no literature, there's no radio, there's no sheet music. So it's very possible that the first music was actually improvised. Now, if you don't believe that music is old based on a fossil, let me show you this bird, and let's reflect on this bird whose name is Snowball. And Snowball was studied by my very good friend, Ani Patel in Tufts. Now, I can't prove that that bird likes dancing, but what I can suggest is that that bird is in training to an external auditory stimulus that's rhythmic in nature. Now, why is that remarkable? We don't see this in the world, but we particularly don't understand the genetics of it when the genetics of this bird was formed thousands and thousands of years before recorded music became a thing. So what does it suggest? It suggests that the biology of living things is geared towards pattern recognition. Okay? That bird is extremely good at taking patterns out of chaos. And maybe that's what our senses really do, is they take the chaotic world and they allow us to identify patterns in it to help us survive and maybe to help us communicate, maybe to help us understand it, and in this case, to help that bird dance. Now, if you've never thought about musical improvisation in jazz, let me explain what's happening in a typical jazz performance. Usually when you go to hear jazz, if you go to a jazz club, you're not going there to hear the memorized parts, okay? There are memorized parts in a jazz performance, but that's usually not what you're there for. It's very different than if you go to the symphony where you know what piece you're going to hear. In fact, in jazz, if you knew exactly what you were going to hear, nobody would probably go to the concert because you're there to hear the improvisation. Now, that's a different way of thinking. Let's compare it to this. I'm going to quickly ask you to do this problem in your head. Great. Now, the answer is D, okay? And there is only one correct answer to this question in the universe that is D. Now, let's compare that to the task of improvising to take 5, where you have a melody and you have chords and you have to improvise essentially whatever you want. There's no correct solution. There's an infinite number of possible solutions. If everybody in this room did their own improvisation to take 5, we'd all come up with a different improvisation. That would be true if there were 1 million people in the room. Okay? It doesn't matter how many times we do this when we're improvising, we're making up a unique solution to the problem. Now, just because music might be created on the spot, spontaneously, that does not mean it's not sophisticated. That does not mean it's not compelling music. And if you think that something that's created on the spot can't be good enough, I want you to watch John Coltrane. And so John Coltrane is a tenor saxophone genius in general, and watch what he does with giant steps. The first part of this is going to be the memorize part, okay? And I'll point out when he starts improvising. Now, again, I challenge you to take 1 year of your life and try to write that out on paper and come up with something as good as he came up with on the spot spontaneously. And you can hear that different takes of this. It's different every single time. And those of you that are musicians and know giant steps, that is not an easy chord sequence to play over. Now, again, the question for me is always how? How is that possible? Where did that come from? And so this is where I think we start merging or marrying music with science. When we think about the fact that creativity, and Dr. Wang said it this morning beautifully, music is created by the brain for the brain. And so I always put this out there that music or art more generally, it's something we revere. It's something we put on a pedestal. It's something that we almost don't want to probe too deeply in, but it's a neurologic product. Music is a product of our brains. It's only by virtue of having complex cognitive processes and subconscious processes that we can generate and do this thing called music. And so if it is another biological behavior that's complex, we should also be able to study it. And we should be able to apply rigorous neuroscientific methods to something as complex as jazz if we design the experiment right, if we ask the questions correctly. And I've asked a million incorrect questions about this because it takes a while to sort of distill something down to its essence. And I'm using methods that are imperfect, and I'll take you through what those are. This is kind of what we wish we could do with somebody's head while they're listening to music or playing music. This doesn't work so well yet. Now, fortunately, we do have the modern fMRI machine, which the technology was really invented in the early 90s in terms of functional MRI, which is different than a regular MRI. When you get a regular MRI, you're getting a picture done. When you get a functional MRI, you're looking at blood flow. And the way this works is when an area of your brain is active, it's consuming oxyhemoglobin. It's converting it into deoxyhemoglobin, which happens to be detectable by a magnet. And so the change in deoxyhemoglobin signal, called the bold signal, is what an fMRI machine detects. And by going into this powerful magnet, you can basically detect what's happening in your brain. But the magnet is agnostic to what you're doing. The scanner doesn't care what you're doing. It's just measuring the blood change. That means that scientists can be quite clever but also inventive in what they wish to do in the scanner, with a couple of caveats. One being that it doesn't have good timing resolution, and another being that you have to keep your head still. And that's very relevant when we talk about musicians. And in the end, what happens is you get not just an anatomical description of an area, but you get a statistical cluster of probability, the probability that something happened in that area of the brain during that behavior. Now, how do you actually apply this to jazz? I'm going to show you a video. Every time I see this video, I'm older, so I look younger and younger. So I'm going to just show this to you. This is a video that demonstrates how we do these jazz experiments. And you'll see me demo the apparatus that we set up. First, it will be memorized, and second part will be improvised. So this is a plastic MIDI piano keyboard that we use for the jazz experiments, and it's a 35-key keyboard that is designed to fit both inside the scanner, magnetically safe, and have minimal interference that would contribute to any artifact, and have this cushions that it can rest on the player's legs while they're lying down in the scanner playing on their back. And it works like this. This doesn't actually produce any sound. It sends out what's called a MIDI signal, or a musical instrument digital interface, through these wires into the box in the computer, which then trigger high-quality piano samples like this. So this is memorized. I'm using double mirrors so I can see my fingers. Improvise. Okay, so that's how we do fMRI jazz. Now, for the students in the room, one thing I want to encourage you on, that piano took me 2 years to get working, okay? It never worked, okay? Literally, experiment after experiment, failure, failure, failure. It became a running joke in the lab, literally. It's like, what are you going to do? I'm going to go work on the piano. Yeah, and then one day it worked, okay? And so just don't despair, because you may be on the cusp of fixing something or figuring something out, and science is hard. Why should this be easy? Why should unraveling the neural substrates of creativity be easy? Okay? If that were the case, this is something that would have figured out many, many, many centuries ago, because creativity has been around forever. Now, once the piano was working, I was like, okay, now what do? We have a working piano. And so what I'm going to suggest is that in order to come up with a relevant study of something like jazz, you need to think about a version of jazz that can both be used in the scanner, but it's also ecologically valid, that is actually reflective of what happens when you go to a jazz club. And the thing that jazz musicians are probably the best at doing, and what they do the most, is play the blues. And so the entire structure of this study was based on the blues. And we wrote a novel piece, and we had them play this piece, and then we had the professional musicians come into the NIH. Yes, everybody thought I was crazy at first. I mean, truly, nobody, the reason I was able to do this study is because I was essentially in a locked room at the NIH with access to a scanner, and nobody really knew what I was doing except for me. That's one of the advantages of being at the NIH rather than asking the NIH for money. And so when we look at these kind of designs, you can start to get kind of a 2x2 where you're looking at a memorize and a control music, some that's low complexity, some that's high complexity. And when you sum all that together and you look at the brain activity, what you get is something like this. And so this is a group three-dimensional surface projection of what's happening in the brain when you switch from memorize to improvising, okay? And so what I'm going to suggest here is a couple of things. This is a complex map, and I apologize that I'm going to try to make it simple, because it's not actually that simple. But the big swath of blue that's happening up front at the top here, this area, that is the prefrontal cortex, but in specific, it's the lateral prefrontal cortex regions that are doing something called deactivating. You could almost suggest that they're turning themselves off when you start improvising. Now, meanwhile, there's an area that's turning itself on relatively right here called the medial prefrontal cortex. Now, these are not the jazz areas of the brain, okay? It's not like if we remove these parts of your brain, the only thing you miss is the ability to play jazz, okay? These are globally important, multifunctional areas of the brain. But some of the key functions of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is effortful planning and conscious self-monitoring. Meanwhile, one of the key functions of the medial prefrontal cortex is self-expression and autobiographical reflection. So if I tell a story about myself, this part of my brain is active. If I am turning off the conscious self-monitoring, you would think that that might be a signature for how I could encourage the flow of unimpeded ideas that are novel. And so we think that this might be the beginnings of a model for spontaneous musical creativity, where in order to do it, it's not so much about turning your brain on, it's about letting go and turning your brain off so that you don't inhibit yourself. Now, that's a concept that we've fleshed out in a lot of subsequent studies. And I think many people that are practitioners of arts or sports or any other pursuit, you sometimes know the idea that you have to let go in order to get better at something. If you try to consciously control your behavior too much, you will get worse at the behavior, not necessarily better. And I'll give you a very funny example. I thought it was funny. I was being interviewed for a news piece, and they said, okay, we want you to walk from here to your lab. I was like, sure, I can walk from here to my lab, and I did this. For some reason, I could not walk when the cameras and the lights were on me, and I looked normal. And they were like, "Can you just walk again?" I was like, "I tried that." And so what was happening was my conscious control over my walking, which is not something I think about, was somehow now in effect. And I was basically destroying my ability to perform this automated, overlearned activity. Now, that study led to a lot of subsequent questions and ideas. And the next question was this idea about, is music the universal language? And this is, I think, something that is a very kind of quaint idea. There's something old-fashioned about it. It's kind of comforting. It's sort of intuitive. You kind of like, meaning we just heard a Balinese performance, and no matter where we're from, we can enjoy it, appreciate it, and reflect on it and think about it. On the other hand, if music is the universal language, and I want to invite Professor Wong to have lunch with me tomorrow by playing the piano, I'm going to be playing for 10,000 years, and he's not going to know that I'm trying to invite him to lunch. So if music is the universal language, it's really bad at what language is actually used for, which is specific propositional thought and communication. I mean, you can't say anything specific using music, okay? We can't communicate. I can't give this talk in music, okay? And I can't even do a simple request using music in most situations. So there's limitations to the analogy. On the other hand, music is a form of communication that's very, very intuitive, and maybe what it's best at is not propositional thought, but emotion. Okay? And maybe the real value of music as this kind of alternate pathway to communication is not linguistic at all. What it really might be is that it's better at communicating human emotion and making you feel emotion and sympathize with what someone else is feeling better than words might do. Now, in jazz, something that happens very often is something called trading fours. And this is when two musicians or a group of musicians have a musical conversation just using music. And this is a video showing Herbie Hancock's band trading fours. So can you hear it? Can you hear that there's a conversation taking place that's not using words? There's a dialogue that's musical happening, an exchange of ideas. So we wanted to take that very basic behavior of trading fours and make an experiment out of that. So now there's a musician in the scanner, but there's another musician in this control room playing together. And what they're going to do is memorize 4-bar chunks and either play them memorized or have a spontaneous musical exchange. And here's a video showing how we did that with Michael Pope, who was the bassist for Chick Corea's electric band.
Come on in. May the fourth be with you.
Nothing in your pocket, great Mike?
No, nothing's in my pocket.
Okay.
So we're setting him up in the scanner. Electrostatic earphones. No ferrous metals in the piano keyboard. So now you see his legs in the scanner, okay? Now I'm responding, and now he's going to respond. So what just happened was we did an fMRI version of trading fours where what was happening was either a spontaneous conversation or a memorized exchange. Now, you can do a lot of different analyses of this. This is what a sort of standard musicological analysis might be. You look for patterns and you look for ways to describe what took place. If you have no idea what you just heard, you call it departure, which is what we called it. And then you can look at the sort of statistical breakdown of these things that are happening. But you can also do something called melodic expectancy. And this is a very interesting idea where you can look and see if there's statistical correlation between a melody and a counterpart. And what we're showing here is that there's a statistical relationship between what is played and what comes next, because they're interacting with one another. And that's not a random relationship. So they're listening to one another and they're responding to one another. And that's true whether it's the complex level condition or the more simple level condition. But then it gets even more interesting when you look at the brain activity. And so this is, again, now sliced brains and a surface projection of the brain to show you the differences when you're going from a musical conversation that's spontaneous compared to one that's memorized. There's a couple of key findings. when you are doing this musical conversation without any words, you have classical Perisylvian language areas that are active. That's very unusual to people that are in the language world because they tend to think of this as language domain specific. But actually, it's not at all. We have what you would call Broca's area and Wernicke's area active. And these are, again, things that we think of as being speech specific areas. But no, there's no words happening here. But meanwhile, there's a deactivation in something called the angular gyrus. It's a very interesting part of the brain because it's involved in semantic specificity. It's involved in helping us decode the meaning of words. So what's happening here? In order to have this spontaneous musical conversation, you are using language areas of the brain without any words, but you're not using or you're shutting down these areas of the brain that you normally would use for semantic specificity. And again, what is this telling us? Well, it might be shedding some light on this notion of music as a universal language. This may be how it's possible for music to be a universal language because it invokes language areas of the brain, but without the need for semantics, without the need for specific vocabulary. Now, if you think about music, improvisation, and language, you naturally lead to freestyle rap. And so now at the time, I was living in Baltimore. And so it made kind of a lot of sense for me to be thinking about this. Now, for those of you that have never thought about freestyle rap or heard it, I'm going to show you a video of Mos Def freestyling. Now, in freestyle, you basically generate rhymes on the spot, okay? And this is how it goes.
Take me to a place called the BK without pause and delay. Give her like pen relay. Don't deal with he say, she say. Ain't working for no cheap pay. The most that beat play. This what the streets say. Hey, Mr. DJ, look at the woman again. That jam got me open. Decide to break it broken. From front, side, the side, middle, the back. Never the whack. I come from Best Star Black. From Louis City, to be exact. Brooklyn.
All right, now, if you're like me, you say, how, okay? How is that possible? And if you're like my father, you say, what is that garbage? And to which I had to say to my dad, Dad, you might hate that, but you can't do it. And I was correct, okay? He is not a freestyle MC. And so the idea here is, it's whether you like rap is irrelevant. The fact is, it's an incredible biological activity that's taking place. And I'm going to prove it to you by having us freestyle together in a minute. Now, so what did we do? We infiltrated the underground hip-hop scene in Baltimore in a series of experiments that I can only describe as completely hilarious and ridiculous and very compelling. And these musicians were really into it. They completely wanted to know what's going on in their brains as they were rapping. There's something called the word game that happens in freestyle rap. And in the word game, what you basically do is get supplied a word, and then you are going to rhyme to that word, and you don't know what's coming next. So this is how it goes. There's a control condition that was memorized, and this is the memorized control condition.
Memory. Thump. Search. Art. Stop.
So we had them do this over and over again, and then we would feed them words that they've never heard before. And this is a video of how this actually takes place. And what you'll see is a couple of things. You'll see there's a fiber optic noise canceling microphone, and that's very important so that we can record the rapping. And then you'll also see the hands are like this. That's really important for rap. That's this. This is bad for head movement and fMRI, okay? So those of you that are trying to do rap, now, I said earlier that we're going to freestyle together. Just so I can show you how hard this is to do, we're going to do this in our heads. Okay? I'm going to tell you the words in advance. The words are like, head, and not. Like, head, and not. No surprises here. Okay? Here's a drum beat. Like. Head. Not. Easy? Right. Does anybody really love what they did? Thought like it was super awesome? So it's really hard to do this. And if you're like me, you find yourself very self-conscious, and you're like, I like Bobby Goulding. Like you really like, you don't know what to say because you're very self-conscious. You're chronically suppressing yourself. Now, here is an example of what Slick Vic, who is the middle subject, did with Like, Head, and Not. He didn't know these words were coming, okay?
Freestyle. Like.
I'm like some kind of weird alien, this for the extraterrestrial celestial sage. Back in the days, I used to sit in pyramids and meditate with two microphones
Head.
over my head. See if I can still listen, spitting off the top and see what you're getting. I teach the children in the back of the classroom about the last days of apocalypse.
Not.
Not really though, because I gotta keep it simple and live with the rhythm. Get you instrumental, man, Super Mario, only the chicken box.
Stop.
So then we look at the brain activity, and what do we see? We see a combination of the previous two experiments. When you are freestyling, you are using your language areas more than when you're doing memorized rap. Now, both are intense language activities, but the freestyle part of it is more language area resource intensive. But meanwhile, the freestyle, you see this now, deactivation in the dorsolateral prefrontal areas. So we see this combination of what might be related to the biological signature of flow state combined with heightened activity in the language areas of the brain that might be responsible for how someone is able to do these things. Now, this question led us to think a lot about the idea of musical genius. And everybody has their different version of what a musical genius is, and I would love to learn about yours. These are some musical geniuses that I've thought a lot about over time. And I want to introduce you to one in particular. If you are familiar with Esperanza Spalding, she's an incredible jazz musician. And what makes her incredible is that she can do something like this.
I used to walk in the shade with my blues on parade, but I'm not afraid. It's over. Past grab your and grab your coat. Leave your worries on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Can't you hear the pitter-pat?
You may have noticed President Obama there in the Kennedy Center. So that is an incredible musician. She's both world-class at voice and at bass, and she can improvise on both at the same time. And so please, if you ever get a chance to hear her play, just go do it. And I was really excited when she called me up and asked me if I would scan her brain.
My name is Esperanza Spalding, and here today I'm asked to be an improviser. I have been really curious about how music and healing interface. When I heard that the Kennedy Center was hosting an event called Music in the Brain, Charles Lim was presenting, and I thought he might be a guide and an ally in the larger mission of investigating how music can serve in a therapeutic context. Well, Dr. Charles Lim had me up in this tube, this teeny little tiny tube, singing some samples of music that were memorized, and then singing improvised melodies over a blues form.
Okay, we're gonna get started. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Memory.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
That is her brain.
I'm really excited to see what commonalities emerge from the minds of all these different creators, who identify as improvisers or who create in a space of improvisation.
So I've shown you now that deactivation in the brain might be one of the signatures of creativity. And so let's look at Esperanza's brain. This is when she's playing a memorized piece of music compared to rest. Okay? Here's when she starts to improvise. Okay? So what are we seeing? We're seeing this almost global deactivation in her brain when she switches to improvising. Again, very complicated neurological, motoric, musical activity, but less activity in the brain compared to when she's memorizing. So we're starting to see these patterns in these expert musicians. Now, I'm going to introduce you to one other musician named Matthew Whitaker. And Matthew Whitaker is a child prodigy, but all the more notable for the fact that he was born blind.
I am Matthew Whitaker, and I am a musician. I'm 17 years old, and I'm also visually impaired.
So today we want to see what's happening in Matthew's brain while he's doing a variety of things. One was playing a blues, and one was playing a song that he'll play for the Kennedy Center tonight, and another was listening to music that he liked and maybe listening to something that wasn't as interesting. And last is having a musical conversation with another musician to see what's happening when two players have a dialogue together, sort of a wordless conversation that's just based on music. The entire time, you're going to be in the scanner room. We're going to be in the control room about maybe 10 feet away from you, but separated by a glass window and a door.
Is it like a recording studio, like control room?
It's sort of like a recording studio. So the goal is to understand the neural underpinnings for something as complex, wonderful, and mysterious as music. And we have a lot of scientific knowledge about how the world works, relatively little knowledge about how the brain enables the arts. Art has been around throughout eternity. As long as there have been humans, there have been art. Every culture, every historical epoch, there's always been art.
And Matthew is amazing because he can play Hammond B3 completely blind, including drawbars and pedals. It's an incredible thing to see. So what did we do? We had him listen to a lot of things. One of the things he listened to was this.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the... Anyone?
And we looked at his brain when he was listening to that, okay? And so this is what he found. So auditory cortex was active, of course. He's listening to sound. Lateral prefrontal cortex makes sense. He's listening to language. Medial prefrontal cortex, remember, this is self-referential. He might have been zoning out as he was listening to this boring language. And then also visual cortex was not active. And keep in mind, he is a blind person, so we did not see occipital activity. Then we had him listen to Snarky Puppy, something he likes quite a bit that sounds like this. And so, again, here's his response to boring speech, and here's what happened when he listens to Snarky Puppy. Okay? So this is how robustly music stimulates his brain compared to boring speech. Very interestingly, visual cortex is active in Matthew Whitaker when he's listening to music. And so we think that he's recruited some of his brain areas for vision to help him with musical tasks, which makes sense when you see the complex spatial things he's able to do. Now, in the last few minutes, I just want to show you a couple of other series of experiments. One is this idea that creativity is not just the domain of adults. And we see this in children all the time. Those of you that have children know that they're very creative. And it would be really fascinating to know how somebody becomes a gifted musician over the course of their lifetime. This girl was very, very interesting because when she was about 11 or 12, she could play like this. And she grew up to be the famous Venezuelan pianist Gabriela Montero. And Gabriela Montero is incredible because she can improvise in the classical domain like this. So I could listen to her play forever. And so again, I was very happy when she asked me to scan her brain. And so we did a series of experiments And to make a very long story short, when you look at the functional connectivity of her, again, when she's going from rote, memorized to improvising, it's hard to see on the screen, but there's a lot more blue in the functional connectivity map on the right side. Now, we've now done these experiments in some other extraordinary musicians. Some of you that are familiar with the late, great Zakir Hussain, we were very lucky to work with Zakir before his passing, and he actually made a tabla that was non-ferromagnetic for us so that he could do his studies in the scanner. And this is Zakir playing in the scanner.
And an improvised segment now.
Now, I had started by talking about the mind of a young girl, and what we did was a series of experiments in the 9 to 11-year-old range of people who had never had piano lessons, and we brought them and we taught them to play a pentatonic scale and improvise by one note per key, one note at a time. We taught them in about 10 minutes, and then they were able to improvise, and it went like this.
Listen, then improvise.
So now what happens when we look at the brain of children that are improvising is an amazing thing. We see functional connectivity in reward areas of the brain that are more active when you're improvising than when you're playing something memorized. Now think about this. Children are showing greater activity in terms of functional connectivity in reward areas of their brain when they're engaging in creativity. And maybe this is the root of why children are always off doing creative things, because it's more rewarding to them. And this gets, again, to the sort of biological basis of some of these activities. Now, I just want to close by talking very briefly about the Sound Health Network, which is a movement that we started in the United States to really explore this idea of music as medicine. And it was really the work of two people, Renee Fleming and Dr. Francis Collins, that allowed this to happen. And eventually what took place was a series of conversations, meetings, discussions, and events. Dr. Wang was a part of this, Dr. Juan Huang was also a part of this, where we eventually wound up convincing the NIH to support music research. And this is a landmark thing for us. It's not a ton of money for the world or of science, but it's a ton of money for music scientists that had not had a reliable funding source. The National Endowment for the Arts got involved in this, these musicians got involved with it, and we actually launched during COVID, and unfortunately were shut down very recently by the Trump administration, sadly. Now, while that's a depressing note to end on, I want to tell you the following. Although the Sound Health Network was shut down, the people were not shut down, okay? So all the people that were in this network, all the people that care about this, all the people that love music and love science and want to see the two work together, we're all still here doing our thing. And so we're just in need of a better context and a better environment, and this will happen again, if not in Washington, D.C., at other places around the world, perhaps here in Bali. Yes. And so I just want to end by saying music allows us to understand the creative brain. It's a fantastic tool for scientists. Is it the only tool? No, but it's one of the most powerful ways that we can manipulate sound experimentally and come up with some really insightful findings about what it means to be a human being, what it means to engage in the arts, and what it means to be creative. These are some of the conclusions that I have, which I've pretty much said these. I'm not going to say them again. These are future questions that I've been thinking about a lot. You probably have your own questions, and they're all equally relevant to these. But to me, one of the key messaging is that we should not eliminate the arts from public education. One thing we see over and over again is this idea that somehow the arts is just about having fun and it's just about entertainment. But it's much more than that. Okay? It's a very important fundamental biological activity. And with that, I want to thank these funding sources that were involved. These are members of my lab group that were involved with everything that I've done. These are other scientists that I've collaborated with or been inspired by or somehow helped by. And these are artists that I had the great pleasure to work with over the years, and a really tremendous group of artists who care so much about these things. And maybe the next time you think about some music or hear some jazz, Miles Davis will sound to you something like this. Okay? And so with that, I just want to thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lim, for your captivating lecture. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but we allow for just one question to Dr. Lim. Raise of hand. Yes, please.
I was wondering why you don't come across with Cecil Taylor if you're interested in improvisation.
Yeah.
Your day's very different kind of, artist.
Yeah. First of all, let me tell you, I am not opposed to working with pretty much any creative music. Right now, I have a grant from the National Endowment for Arts to work with the NEA Jazz Masters, which is a fantastic opportunity. But no, pretty much any musician that wants to get involved with this work can do so. And if you know Cecil and he wants to be involved in this,
he passed away already, unfortunately.
yeah. So that's it's one of these things where we have to. Actually the jazz population is an elderly and dying population. It's a sad but true thing in terms of the jazz master population. But creativity has no end to it. I mean, it's an infinite number of studies that we could do with this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lim. Please give a big round of applause for Dr. Lim.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's such a mind-blowing lecture.